Welcome to Crown TV. Immerse yourself with a captivating audio from our stories. We provide an alternative way to read books in audio. We upload many audiobooks as possible, from bestsellers to timeless classic. Subscribe and stay tuned for new upload.
Episode 206, The Opening Ceremony. Alex was confused because he didn't recognize what language the man was speaking. He asked with an embarrassed smile, "Can you speak English?" The man shook his head and looked puzzled. He repeated his original words to Alex, but Alex didn't recognize the language. Other people around him were also looking at each other with puzzled expressions. No one could understand what the man was saying. "Give him one of the wipes," Nellie suddenly suggested. Alex didn't know why, but he took out a pack of wet wipes from behind the counter and gave it to the man. The man smiled and took a wipe out of the packet. When he was finished cleaning his fingers, he reached back into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He asked a question in the same language as before. Before Alex could protest, Nellie responded to him in the same language. Shrugging, the man took out a few coins and handed them to Alex. Then he pushed his way through the crowd and left. Alex was surprised that Nellie had known what to do. He asked her, "Nellie, I didn't know that you could speak a foreign language. What language was he speaking?" "There's a lot you don't know about me. He was speaking Malay," Nellie replied proudly as she continued making pancakes. "How can you speak Malay?" Alex asked in surprise. "It's nothing. What's the big deal?" she said casually. She handed him a pancake to the client and then looked at Alex and said, "Your girlfriend didn't ask you to come here to help me. If you don't go and find her, she won't be happy." "I told you that Philippa and I are just friends. Don't call her my girlfriend," Alex said crossly. After spending a long time helping in the food truck, Alex took off his apron, took 2 bottles of soda from the container, and gave the money for them to Nellie. "You're busy. I'll leave you to it," he said and walked out of the truck. Nellie watched him leave and said with a sneer, "You say that you're in love with someone else, but I've seen the way you look at that girl. And who are you buying those drinks for?" Alex turned to explain, but Nellie looked so cynically at him that he knew he wouldn't be able to convince her. He simply said, "Think whatever you want," and walked away. He walked to the stadium entrance where Philippa had told him she would be working. When he got there, he saw 2 rows of young people in volunteer uniforms standing on each side of the entrance, guiding the guests in. One of them was Philippa, so he walked over to her. "Philippa, here's a drink for you," he said as he smiled and handed her the cola. She smiled at him and said, "Thank you. Can you hang on to it for a while for me? There's so many people arriving at the moment. I'm very busy." He sat down next to her and watched her communicating fluently with foreign visitors in their native languages. He admired her very much. A few moments later, a beautiful woman arrived and stood in front of Philippa and Alex. She was wearing a blue and white silk dress suit, and her makeup was exquisite. She looked just like a top model walking down the runway. It was Miriam. Alex saw her and immediately stood up. Pointing at her, he said, "Miriam, where's my backpack?" "Your backpack? I've lost it," she replied with a sneer. When he heard that she had lost his backpack, he felt a chill in his heart. He said angrily, "You're sick, you know that?" Miriam smiled at him cruelly. "Oh, you think you have a right to scold me? I also want to tell you that I found a diary inside the backpack. I burned every page of it." This was a lie. She didn't know what Daryl had done with the diary they found in Alex's bag, but she knew it was important to Alex, and she wanted to hurt him. "That was my most precious possession. How could you burn it?" When he heard that Debbie's diary had been burned to ashes, Alex shivered all over. He rushed at Miriam, raising his arm to slap her across the cheek. Several volunteers stepped over to restrain him. Philippa also grabbed him and whispered, "She's a lead volunteer. She'll be leading the athletes into the stadium later. You'll be in so much trouble if you hurt her." Alex managed to contain his anger. He tried to satisfy himself by glaring at Miriam coldly. She saw that he wasn't going to try to attack her again and relaxed slightly. She teased him. "You stupid loser! You still want to hit me, don't you?" Then she looked at Philippa and said with a contemptuous smile, Philippa, it seems that you really are getting together with Alex. Are you really willing to stoop so low? What does that say about you?" She chuckled and then continued, "Look at you compared to me. We go to the same university, but look at us now, huh? You're just some lowly volunteer whose only job is to stand at the entrance and show the audience where to go. I'm the lead volunteer. I will lead the athletes into the stadium. What's more, I will lead the American team and I'll appear on live TV." "You only got that role by sucking up to Daryl. What's so impressive about that?" Alex sneered. "It doesn't matter how I got to where I am. What matters is that I'm far more important than your girlfriend. She's only qualified to stand at the door, while I will be leading the American athletes with the whole world watching." Miriam glared at Alex and continued, "Have you had a good look at my outfit? It was designed by an Italian designer. Only 40 people in the world have the same suit. It's worth more than $10,000. Now, look at what your girlfriend's wearing. A volunteer's polo shirt. There's no comparison." Philippa glared at Miriam angrily. But when Miriam called her Alex's girlfriend, Philippa's heart fluttered a little and her cheeks flushed. She looked away. Then they all heard a man's voice calling, "Honey, why don't you go in?" A tall, fashionable young man walked over with his cell phone in his hand. It was Daryl. Miriam took his arm and said, "Daryl, I'm so glad you're here. Look who showed up." "Isn't that the man who tried to grab you before and then got into a fight with Jake? Hey, Alex, why are you here?" Daryl said with a sneer. "Philippa, you should aim a bit higher. You should find yourself a man more like Daryl. Who wants a loser like Alex?" Miriam said proudly. "Baby, it's late. Let's go in," Daryl said, and then he accompanied Miriam into the stadium. Philippa said to Alex, "Just sit there for a minute. There's no point being angry with such people. It's not worth it." She indicated a seat behind her and continued to guide the audience into the stadium. Later that evening, everyone was in the stadium, and Philippa was finally finished with her work. She said to Alex, "Let's go inside and sit down for a while." His mood had improved a little. He looked at her, a little surprised, and said, "Don't we need tickets?" She assured him, "We have a special volunteer area where we can watch everything live on a big screen." They were about to go in when they heard someone call, "Alex!" He recognized Nellie's voice. Looking around, they spotted her heading toward them. She asked, "Are you going to the stadium? Please, can I go with you?" Alex asked, "Shouldn't you be working on the stand today? There will be lots of people around." Philippa said with a smile, "Now that the audience is in the stadium, who's going to be buying pancakes outside? Besides, someone else is running the pancake stand for her." Alex remembered that Nellie had hired someone to work on the stand. Nellie tapped his forehead and said, "Philippa is smart, Alex. Your brain is like a pimple." Looking at Nellie and Philippa in front of him, Alex realized he was feeling happier than he had in a while. He didn't mind having a pimple for a brain. For the moment, he was satisfied. Philippa took them to the volunteer rest area. It was a large area with 8 big screens on the walls, which were broadcasting the opening ceremony. There were more than 100 people in the hall, chatting with each other and watching the screens. Alex sat down on a chair in front of one of the screens. At 8 o'clock sharp, a dazzling firework display announced the official start of the opening ceremony. This was followed by 2 dance performances. Then, the TV commentator said, "And now the athletes will start to enter the stadium." On screen, they could see the parade of athletes from all over the world being led into the stadium by the lead volunteers. Belgium, Colombia, France, Spain. Finally, the host delegation from the USA walked in, and there was a huge round of applause. Miriam held the sign saying USA proudly in front of her as she led the athletes in. There were 10 seconds of TV footage of Miriam, which was a significant portion of the live broadcast of the opening ceremony. She looked stunning and was smiling sweetly at the camera. When the people in the hall saw her, they were all full of praise. All the lead volunteers were incredibly beautiful. After the athletes entered the stadium, they moved on to the next part of the ceremony. The volunteers in the rest area were glued to the live broadcast. Suddenly, several people entered, and someone said in a loud voice, "Daryl, didn't I look good in the ceremony just now?" It was Daryl who had walked in with Miriam on his arm. "The most beautiful woman in the world. I was watching live, and when you appeared, the commentators couldn't stop talking about your beauty," Daryl said with a smile, as he pulled out a chair for Miriam to sit in. Nellie saw Miriam and whispered, "Ugh, I can't stand her." Most of the people in the hall knew Daryl, and many recognized that Miriam was the lead volunteer that they had just watched in the ceremony. They all stood up to greet them. "Daryl, is this your girlfriend? She's stunning," said one man. Another agreed. "Yes, I saw her in the ceremony. She looked like a celestial being." "Daryl, are you here to watch the opening ceremony with us?" asked an admirer. "You're all right. Of course, my girlfriend must be the most beautiful of the lead volunteers," Daryl laughed. "Oh, they're here too," Miriam said when she saw Alex. She pulled Daryl toward them with a sinister expression. They approached Philippa and Alex and said, "Didn't you see me and Daryl walk in? Everyone else stood up to say hello to us, but you decided to just sit there?" "What do we care that you've just walked in?" Nellie said with a sneer. "Hey, you ugly cow! How dare you speak to me like that?" Miriam said angrily. "I'm the lead volunteer for the American athletes. Compared to me, you're nothing but trash. How dare you talk to me like that?" She shouted to all the other volunteers. "Everyone, look at these 3 people. 2 of them were my high school classmates. They went to a good school, and yet now they're all losers. They came here to volunteer, and they think they're good enough to mix with people like us." Then she pointed to Nellie and said, "And look at this ugly freak. We have beautiful men and beautiful women in the hall today. She really shouldn't have been allowed in, don't you think?" Episode 207, The Sultan of Brunei. Until that moment, no one had been paying any attention to Alex and his friends. When Miriam pointed out that the girl with short hair had acne scars on her face and was quite unattractive, everyone started to whisper about her. But they weren't heartless. There was no way that they would kick her out because of the way she looked. Miriam put her arm around Daryl and said, "Daryl, you should kick these 3 people out. They have no respect for us." Daryl said aloud to everyone, "Listen to me. These 3 are not good people." He pointed at Alex. "This guy grabbed my girlfriend in a restaurant 2 days ago. Luckily, I was there, and I stopped him from doing anything else." Then he pointed at Philippa. "I really feel like this girl should know better than to hang out with this creep. My girlfriend knows her. They went to the same school. But clearly she's not making smart choices." He didn't even bother to comment specifically on Nellie. Instead, he gestured at all 3 of them and summed up his judgment, saying, "They shouldn't be here. They're bringing down the whole room." When they listened to Daryl's words, some people started to agree with him. One young volunteer said, "Mom, look at that boy's cheap clothes. I thought he was a good student in a work-study program, but it turns out that he's the sort of boy to push his luck with that beautiful woman." His mother agreed. "You're right, and the girl is just as bad. She looks so pretty, but why would she mix with such scum? She should be more careful about who she associates with." Her husband added, "Birds of a feather flock together. It's true, you know." Alex frowned and said to everyone, "Please don't believe their words. They're not telling you the whole truth. They have it in for me, so they're trying to stir up trouble, that's all." Miriam interjected, "Oh, please. How dare you claim that you didn't grab my hand that day?" Alex started to try to explain. "I grabbed your hand because—" But Daryl interrupted him. He said, "You heard me. This loser just admitted it himself. I think these 3 should leave now. Are you all with me?" "But we don't have the right to drive them out," said one boy. "Listen, I personally know the director of the U.S. Olympic Games. It's not a problem. I will give $2,000 to the first person to kick these 3 out. I will also give a further $2,000 to the Olympic Committee," Daryl said with a smile. "Really?" A portly man stood up excitedly. When he heard that the first person to volunteer would be given $2,000, he called out, "I'll help." When everyone realized that the portly man was going to be given the reward, lots of others started shouting out. "I'll do it," said one guy. "I'll come too," said his friend. "I want to help," said another. More than 10 young people rushed at Alex and his friends, wanting to kick them out so that they could get the reward. "What are you doing? Leave us alone!" Nellie exclaimed angrily. Philippa was frightened. She grabbed Alex's hand and whispered in horror, "Alex, what are we going to do?" Alex immediately stepped in front of the 2 girls, blocking everyone from reaching them. He held a stool above his head and waved it violently at the crowd. He managed to keep them a couple of yards away. Assessing the current situation, he realized that they could not stay there any longer. He thought, "If those guys really do kick us out, they could hurt the girls. I won't be able to stop them." He shouted, "Get out of the way. We'll leave by ourselves." "Alex, what a hero you are. Now suddenly you want to leave anyway. You're such a loser," Miriam said triumphantly with a smile. She raised her cell phone to Philippa's face. A video of the parade played on the screen. "Philippa, look. The whole of America, and probably the whole world, has just watched me leading the parade. Although you go to one of the best universities, you're just a menial volunteer. I bet for the rest of your life you'll never do anything as great as what I've done today. You should be dying of shame." Daryl also sneered, "You stupid loser. Now you want to leave by yourself?" He looked at the crowd and said, "Well, I won't let him. Listen to me. If you throw him out, I'll give you another $10,000. I bet you'd all like to earn that kind of money today." Suddenly, there was pandemonium. It was useless for Alex to wave the stool again. When they heard the amount that Daryl was offering, nothing would stop the young men from trying to earn it. They rushed at Alex and his friends, looking possessed. When Alex realized that he couldn't stop them, he threw down the stool and stood in front of Philippa and Nellie, trying to protect them. At that moment, the door of the hall opened, and a majestic voice boomed. "What are you doing?" Hearing the man's voice, everyone froze. Then they turned around. A middle-aged man walked into the crowd. His expression was livid. He said furiously, "You are here to help us run the Olympic Games, not to fight. Do you want me to throw you all out?" It was Sebastian Wade, the director of volunteers for the Washington Olympics and an important member of the organizing committee. He was responsible for the volunteers, the security guards, and other helpers. The volunteers knew that Sebastian held a lot of power. If he was dissatisfied with them, he would not only deduct money from their wages, but he would also fail their evaluations and prevent them from receiving any awards or preferential treatment from the school. All the work they had put in over the previous month would be in vain. "Mr. Wade, they're just having fun. They're young people," Daryl said politely as he approached Sebastian. "Daryl, you're here too. Hello," replied Sebastian. Then he turned to the volunteers and said, "We have an emergency in the opening ceremony. The Sultan of Brunei is due to give a speech on the rostrum later, but his translator is cancelled last minute. We're in desperate need of someone who can speak Malay. Can any of you help us?" When she heard this, Nellie was slightly stunned and murmured in a low voice, "If the Sultan is here, then the Queen must be around here somewhere." "Nellie, what are you talking about?" Alex and Philippa heard what Nellie murmured, but didn't understand what she was talking about. "Nothing," said Nellie. The other students looked at each other and thought the situation was probably hopeless. Most of them had taken French or Spanish in school. Malay was a very uncommon language in American education. "No one?" Sebastian asked aloud, but no one stepped forward. Several people answered, "No, sorry." Sebastian put away his cell phone, frowned, and said, "If we can't find a translator, this opening ceremony will be regarded by the world as a disaster. What can I do?" Sebastian's eyes strayed to one of the large screens on the wall. On the screen, he could see the Sultan seated on the podium. Beside him was an empty seat with the label, Queen of Brunei. Nellie saw what he was looking at and asked in a loud voice, "Didn't the Queen come?" Sebastian replied in a deep voice, "The Queen should also have been here, but she couldn't attend today." Nellie was happy. She grabbed Alex and whispered in his ear, "Tell him that you can speak Malay." "Huh?" Alex was surprised, but when he saw Nellie's joyful face, he suddenly remembered that she had been able to speak Malay in the square that afternoon. He couldn't figure out what she wanted now, but he trusted her. So he raised his hand and said in a loud voice, "Mr. Wade, I can speak Malay." Everyone looked at Alex, and Sebastian said with joy, "Really? That's wonderful. You'll be speaking with the Sultan. Quickly, it's not too late. Come with me." Alex led Nellie and Philippa over to Sebastian. Miriam stepped up to them and said coldly, "Mr. Wade, this boy is lying to you. He and I are old classmates, and I know that he can't speak Malay." Everyone assumed that Alex had only said that he could speak Malay to give himself a chance to get away. They realized that if he managed to get out, they would lose their opportunity to earn money from Daryl. Other people quickly started to point at Alex. One said, "Mr. Wade, he can't speak Malay." "He's lying," said another. Someone else shouted, "He's a loser. He probably doesn't even know the English alphabet, let alone speak another language. Don't let him leave." Sebastian looked at Alex's shabby appearance and cheap clothes and started to have some doubts. However, under such circumstances, he had no option but to take a risk. Some of the Sultan's subordinates were also there waiting for him to resolve the problem. He frowned but quickly made a decision. He turned to Alex and said, "You come with me." Alex, Nellie, and Philippa followed Sebastian to the main office of the Olympic Committee. The chief director was frowning, but when he saw that Sebastian had brought someone who could speak Malay, he was overjoyed. He pulled Alex toward the two Brunei subordinates and asked him to speak with them. "Well, I don't know what to say," Alex said with an embarrassed smile. "What?" The chief director was furious. Alex said quickly, "You don't have to be angry. I don't have anything to say, but my friend does." Then he pushed Nellie to the front. Nellie and the two subordinates understood each other perfectly. The chief director and Sebastian were relieved. Nellie looked at the chief director and said, "I'm happy to translate, but I don't want to be on the camera directly. Please let Alex stand on the podium and be filmed. I'll dress up as a mascot and whisper the words to him. Is that okay?" The chief director nodded. He had overheard some of what Daryl had said about Nellie and thought the girl might be self-conscious about her appearance. He was happy to have her wear a disguise if it meant she would serve as a translator. "Director, I think we should also have a Spanish translator next to me. Spanish is the second most spoken language in the U.S. after all. Is it okay if my friend also comes up on the podium?" Alex said to the director. Thinking of the way that Miriam had ridiculed Philippa, he wanted to give her the opportunity to use her language skills in front of the world. That would show which of them deserved to look down on the other. Okay. The director agreed, and immediately sent Alex and Philippa to have their clothes and makeup done. Alex and Philippa quickly dressed and had their makeup done. Nellie put on the costume of the mascot, which was a bald eagle. No one would be able to recognize her with the head part of the costume covering her face. It was soon time for the Sultan to speak. The director asked the organizers to lead Alex and Philippa into position next to the Sultan. Standing on the podium next to the Sultan, Alex felt very excited. He was impressed with the dignified appearance of the Sultan. It all felt like he was in a trance or a dream. He found it difficult to believe that it was all really happening. A voice announced, "Next, let's welcome the Sultan of Brunei." Thunderous applause broke out in the stadium. Episode 208, Star of the Show. The Sultan of Brunei stood up. Alex and Philippa were both a little dazed. Nellie, who was dressed as the mascot, gently touched Alex's arm to reassure him. The Sultan began to speak majestically into the microphone. However, he spoke in Malay, and very few people in the audience could understand him. Alex heard Nellie whisper to him, "Hello, everyone. I am very happy to be here with you in the United States of America." Alex felt relieved that he could hear Nellie's translation clearly. He repeated her words into the microphone. "Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you in the United States of America." Philippa, standing on the other side, heard Alex's English translation and immediately translated what he said into Spanish. There was a burst of applause and cheers from the audience. Alex and Philippa started to relax as they listened attentively to the Sultan. With Nellie's help, Alex delivered the English translation of the speech, and Philippa delivered the speech again in Spanish. They cooperated very well with each other. In the volunteer rest hall at the moment, everyone was astonished to see Alex and Philippa on the podium with the Sultan of Brunei. They couldn't believe that they had really dared to go up. Miriam was particularly bewildered, and she stood like a statue staring at the screen. When Alex had first stepped up onto the podium, Miriam was shocked, but she still didn't believe that he could speak Malay. She thought that the Sultan would speak, and Alex wouldn't be able to translate. He would disgrace himself and the whole U.S. Olympic Committee in front of the whole world. She figured it would turn into a diplomatic nightmare. She smiled to herself at the trouble that he would be in. She thought, "Alex, you really are the most stupid fool in the world. And Philippa, you are willing to accompany him to also make a fool of yourself. You only have yourself to blame." However, when Alex smoothly translated the Sultan's speech, everyone was awestruck. There was a burst of admiration in the hall. Miriam's heart froze and her whole body felt numb. Questions were racing through her mind. She wondered when and where Alex had learned the language. It had only been 2 years since she had last seen him. How had he become fluent in a new language so quickly? The live broadcast camera remained focused on the Sultan, but Alex and Philippa were also visible on the side of the screen. The volunteers watching them had gotten over their shock of seeing them up there and were expressing their admiration for them. One man said, "Those two are amazing. They're both excellent at foreign languages." His friend said, "The camera's been on them the whole time that the Sultan's been speaking. They're live on TV and will be seen by people all over the country and all over the world. That's amazing. I really envy them." "They're the people we were about to kick out just now. Who would have thought that they would be the big stars of the opening ceremony? They're even more important than those of us who run the show." Miriam's expression was pure fury. She couldn't bear it. In her mind, they were still two losers. She was miserable. She muttered, "So, they're translating for the leader of a small country. What's the big deal?" By that time, Alex and Philippa had finished translating for the Sultan. On screen, the viewers could see that the Sultan was talking to the U.S. president. But then he turned back to Alex and gave him a thumbs up, as if praising him for his good translation skills. The volunteers watching were even more shocked when they saw the president actually shaking Alex's hand. "Whoa, the Sultan just gave him a thumbs up," one man said. "I want to have a closer look at him. I feel very honored that I met him. He even shook the president's hand," said his girlfriend excitedly. "That boy is going places," someone else stated. Miriam was horrified. Before that moment, she thought that even if Alex had done the translation at the opening ceremony, he was still just a loser. But now everything was different. He had personally met and shaken the hand of the president. That put him way above her in Miriam's mind. Alex, Philippa, and Nellie were led off the podium by the organizers and were taken straight to the director's office. The director of the U.S. Olympic Committee and more than 20 staff members were standing in the office, smiling and clapping their hands. The director went to Alex and shook his hand vigorously. He said, "Thank you. Without you, the opening ceremony would have been a disaster. You should feel very proud of your role today." "Director, you're welcome," Alex said. Then he looked at Nellie and said, "But today it was my friend, Nellie, who should receive the honor." Yes, Director, I am the translator. You should be grateful to me. Nellie pushed Alex aside, stood in front of the director, and said with a smile, However, I don't need you to thank me officially. I have a food cart outside, and all I ask is that you buy your dinner from me. Certainly, of course, definitely, the director agreed. Then he turned and said to his subordinates, After the opening ceremony, let's all go to this young lady's cart. We will spend plenty of money. Yes, of course, everyone agreed. Nellie giggled. Now that the opening ceremony was over, the director invited Alex, Nellie, and Philippa to dinner, but Alex politely declined. He thanked the director, and they walked out of the office. As they were leaving the stadium, Philippa suddenly remembered. Hang on, I left my bag in the volunteer rest area. I'll go with you to get it, Alex offered. When they reached the rest area, they paused in the doorway. Alex told the girls to wait at the door. He said, Don't come in. We don't know what everyone will do. They might surround us again. I'll go in alone. I don't want either of you to get hurt. Alex pushed the door open and went in. Everyone turned and looked at Alex. One by one, they stood up and stared at him. They each felt anxious when they thought about how they had tried to kick him out earlier. They thought, Why has he come back? We treated him so badly before and tried to kick him out. Has he come back to take his revenge on us? Of course, this was not the same man that they had ridiculed earlier. Now, he was someone who had shaken hands with the president. They now looked at him in a completely different light. You still want to get rid of me, don't you? Alex looked at everyone, frowned, and said, I'm just here to get my friend's bag, and then I'll leave. If you still want to fight me, what are you waiting for? The volunteers were relieved to hear that he was only there to collect a bag, not to confront them over how they had behaved earlier. With a long sigh of relief, one of the men nearest to Alex said, No, Alex, you misunderstood. We were wrong before. You're very welcome here. Another said, Yes, of course. Which bag is yours? I'll get it for you. Come in and bring your friends, said another. Alex was astounded. He still remembered how scared he had been of these people just an hour before. He couldn't believe they had changed their attitudes so quickly. Philippa and Nellie were still waiting by the door, and they started to worry about Alex. When they pushed open the door, they saw how everyone was welcoming him, and they were also surprised. Nellie laughed. Of course, they must have seen Alex shaking hands with the president, and now they're afraid of him. We don't have to be scared of them now. They won't say anything to us if we're with him. Nellie pushed the door open and went in, pulling Philippa with her. They went over to Alex. Why did you come in? Alex asked. Nellie smiled and whispered back, It's okay. Then she looked around her and said to the other volunteers, You all wanted to kick us out before. Why don't you do it now? Come and try it. Earn your money from Daryl. The volunteers were very worried that Alex would report them to the volunteer director. Now, even the director of the U.S. Olympics was indebted to him. Alex had the power to ruin them all. They were desperate to please him and get into his good books. No, we weren't thinking straight before, one man pleaded. Another said beseechingly, Alex, buddy, we were wrong before. We're all friends here. We're on your side. Of course we have no right to kick you out. We wouldn't even try, said another. Huh, Nellie said with a sneer. You've all changed your attitudes very quickly. Do you expect us to forgive you? She continued, "When Alex was speaking with Mr. Wade earlier, he had told him about your terrible behavior. He told Alex that he can punish you as he sees fit." Alex was dumbstruck. He knew that Mr. Wade hadn't said anything like that. But he glanced at Nellie and nodded. Nellie looked at the crowd and said with a leisurely smile, "Yes, you heard me right. These were the director's exact words." Everyone was shocked. All of a sudden, Nellie roared at the crowd, "Now get down on your knees." They were all petrified and deeply regretted their previous behavior. They were desperate to make up for their mistakes, but didn't know how. Nellie's roar made many of them tremble, and more than half of them dropped instantly to their knees. When the other half saw the others were on their knees, they also dropped to the ground. The only two people who refused to kneel were Miriam and Daryl. They sat on their chairs and looked around them. They didn't know what to do. Episode 209, David's Cunning Trick. "I see that some of you still don't want to admit your mistakes," Nellie said as she glanced at Daryl and Miriam. She smiled and continued, "It seems that there are culprits here who refuse to admit that they were wrong. However, I don't think we need to be here anymore. We're going to leave, and we won't be responsible for what happens to you once we've gone. Alex, let's go." Nellie pulled Alex and Philippa toward the exit, preparing to leave. Behind them, there was a cry from the crowd. "Alex, don't go," someone shouted. "Girls, why don't you stay?" asked someone else. "Give us a chance to make it up to you," the first man called. Nellie smiled at Alex and Philippa. She turned back to the crowd with a bitter look on her face and said, "Look, those two are refusing to kneel down. How can we really believe that you all feel repentant?" Everyone looked at Miriam and Daryl, and several people whispered urgently at them. "Please kneel," said one man. "Come on, kneel," said another. Another pleaded, "It's not good for any of us if you refuse to kneel." Daryl was deep in thought. Although Miriam was also afraid, she felt sure that he would protect her. There was no way that she could bear to kneel down to Alex and Philippa. She stood up and exclaimed stridently, "You're asking me to kneel for this loser? It's impossible. I will never respect them." Suddenly, Daryl stood up and slapped her across the face. He had been hesitant to kneel down himself, but he didn't want to infuriate Alex further with her words. He was worried that if Alex could now influence the president himself, he could choose to ruin his business and his reputation in D.C. There wasn't time to think. He was desperate to shut Miriam. All he could think to do was to slap her across the face. Miriam clutched her cheek, glaring at Daryl in disbelief. "Daryl?" He didn't reply, but just sighed deeply and kneeled on the ground. He lowered his head to hide his face, which was red and hot with shame. That left Miriam as the only person who wasn't kneeling. No one had confronted her before because they were afraid of Daryl. Now that he was also kneeling, they all started yelling at her. "Miriam, get down on your knees," shouted one girl. "Kneel down, girl," yelled a man. "Do you want us all to suffer?" asked another angrily. A boy kneeling beside Miriam stealthily shoved the backs of her knees. She wobbled and fell to her knees on the ground. "Well, that's better," Nellie said with a smile. Alex and Philippa looked at each other with wry smiles. They were both impressed with Nellie's boldness and amused at her love of trouble. "Let's go to the front," Nellie said, as she led Alex and Philippa to the front, where they sat down on chairs. Nellie said to Alex, "Well, I've sorted them all out for you. Remember how they insulted all of us before. Now it's up to you how you want to deal with them." Alex looked at Philippa. She didn't look angry. She clearly felt that the volunteers had been punished enough. He looked at Nellie with a small smile and said in a low voice, "The most important thing for people is their dignity. You made them kneel down to us. For them, that's much more hurtful than being beaten up. I think that's punishment enough." Nellie had been waiting eagerly to hear what inventive kind of punishment Alex had in mind. When she heard that he wanted to let them go, she rolled her eyes at him and said, "Really? That's all? That's so disappointing." She crossed her arms huffily. Shaking his head, Alex walked up to Miriam and said, "Miriam, that diary was precious to me and you destroyed it. Then you and Daryl provoked these people to attack us and drive us out. And you're one of my old classmates. You're a really horrible person." Miriam looked at Alex coldly, but she didn't dare say anything. She was afraid that if she screamed at him again, Daryl wouldn't support her. Alex said, "If you insult my friends again, I won't let it go." Then he went to Daryl, who lowered his head. He only hoped that Alex would punish him quickly. Before he knew what was happening, his nose was throbbing, and he realized that Alex had punched him in the face. He fell to the ground and lay there on his back. Daryl was out cold for a few seconds. When he woke up, there were 2 streams of bright red blood flowing out of his nose. Alex went back to Nellie. She clapped her hands and said with a smile, "Good. You stood up for yourself. Good job, loser." He replied with a smile, "We're done here. Let's go." He picked up Philippa's bag and they all walked out together. The people kneeling in the hall quickly made way for them to walk through. Nellie said goodbye to Alex and Philippa and went to the food truck. They took a cab back to the campus, where Alex walked Philippa to the girls' dormitory. Philippa was very grateful to Alex for everything that had happened at the opening ceremony. She said, "Thank you for everything tonight. If you hadn't been there, I don't know what would have happened." Alex replied with a smile, "It's Nellie we should both be thanking. Besides, you and I were classmates for many years. You shouldn't feel the need to thank me. You really still consider me an outsider, don't you?" Philippa blushed slightly and lowered her head. She said softly, "I don't think of you as an outsider." She blushed even more, quickly said goodbye, and ran into the dormitory. Alex watched her go, shook his head, and turned back to his dormitory. David Drake was lying in bed in his villa, looking at Debbie's diary. Reading the diary, he had learned all about her and the loser Alex. Using this information, he had been able to make rapid progress in his relationship with Leona Marvel. He had years of experience with women, and he saw himself as an expert. He believed that he had now reached the point where he should cement his relationship with Leona. He looked back at the diary and read the next scene, which described how Debbie had been bullied by Madison Robbins and her 3 friends on campus. That's when she first met Alex. When he read about the love between Debbie and Alex, he decided that he wanted his own relationship with Leona. He closed the diary, murmuring to himself, "I will propose to you tomorrow. You better not refuse me." The following day, Leona arrived early at the university gate to meet David. He had arranged to take her to visit the beautiful West Lake. Leona was very happy. For the past 2 weeks, David had been dressing in cheap clothes to try to understand what life was like for people less fortunate than himself. They had shared many experiences during that time. For example, when Leona was bullied in a restaurant, David defended her with a wine bottle. In the end, the bully had kneeled on the ground and apologized. She also knew that David had donated $50,000 to the Red Cross, although no one else believed it. Leona had no way of knowing that his behavior was all an act based on what he had read about her in her diary. She felt that his very presence made the air sweeter. "Leona, I'm coming," David called when he saw her waiting. Once again, he was dressed in cheap, shabby clothes. His forehead was glistening with sweat. She said to him, "I know that as the son of a rich family, you feel that it's important to experience different kinds of life, but surely you've had enough now." She looked at his sweaty head and felt sorry for him. She took out a paper towel and wiped the sweat off his face. Throughout the last 10 days that they had spent time together, Leona had started to feel more comfortable with him. He looked at her and replied with a smile, "I am tired, but if it means that you'll take care of me, it's all worth it." Leona blushed but continued to wipe his forehead. She felt happy initially, but then was overcome by a burst of melancholy when she remembered that he was her sister's fiancé. Most of the time, she managed not to think about it. David got off his bike and said, "Come on, let's go get a cab and go to West Lake." They took a cab to the beautiful West Lake area. Because of the Olympic Games, there were more tourists there than usual. They took a leisurely stroll around the lake together. They were so absorbed with the beauty of the lake that they didn't notice the time pass. Suddenly they realized that they were hungry and saw that it was almost midday. David asked Leona to sit on a bench by the lake while he went to get them some food from the cafe. However, he didn't go to the cafe, but to a hidden grove. Colin Patterson had been waiting there for him, along with the 3 girls he had paid to ridicule him previously. Before, they hadn't known who he was and were committed fully to the performance. Now that they knew he was the wealthy David Drake, they were reluctant to even pretend to bully him. When the 3 girls saw David, they immediately began apologizing. "David, we're so sorry. We went way over the top last time. We apologize." "Don't worry about it. It's fine," David told them as he waved his hand dismissively. Then he looked at Colin and asked, "Have you explained everything to them clearly?" "It's clear," Colin said respectfully. "That's good." David looked at the girls and said, "When the time comes, you must do exactly as Colin told you to. Do you understand?" "Yes, yes," the 3 girls replied anxiously. "Good. Go now," he told them. And then the 3 girls walked toward Leona, who was still waiting by the lake. Leona was gazing into the lake when she heard a girl behind her cry, "Leona!" She looked around and saw a girl walking toward her. She recognized her as one of the 3 who had ridiculed her and David that day on campus. She remembered that they had tried to make him feel small. When he had ignored them, they had become angry instead. "What are you doing here?" she asked her nervously. "I saw you with that stupid loser. Have you no shame?" the girl said. This was a carefully crafted reenactment of a time Leona, called Debbie then, though she didn't remember this part of her life, had been bullied back at Preston University. On that occasion, 3 girls had pushed her into the water. Of course, that didn't happen this time. This time, they mocked her and pretended that they were going to push her into the lake, when suddenly, with a roar, David rushed into the water. He kicked the 3 girls out of the way and saved Leona. Several minutes later, 2 cars stopped at the side of the road. A man who looks like a mafia boss stepped out, followed by at least 10 younger men. The boss seemed to threaten Leona, but David stood in front of her and refused to let them near her. The younger men started hitting him, but he held Leona behind him and continued to protect her so that she didn't get hurt. "No!" she screamed. She wanted to protect David, but he was holding her so tightly that she couldn't move at all. "Don't worry, I won't let them hurt you," he whispered in her ear. Drops of blood from his mouth fell onto her face. She couldn't bear to see him getting hurt, and she cried out to their attackers, "Don't hit him! Please stop!" Just as Leona began to fear it would never end, a helicopter appeared from the sky. 8 figures jumped out and rushed over to David. "Are you okay, sir?" asked one of the men. "I'm fine," David answered. Then he tilted his head toward Leona and asked, "Leona, are you okay?" Then he fainted. She hugged his head and cried out, "David! David!" Tears were flowing down her face. Episode 210, Leona and David are engaged. With David and Leona on board, the helicopter flew straight to the nearest hospital. David was taken directly to the emergency room. Leona waited outside anxiously. She wished that it was her rather than David who was lying in the emergency room. Later that afternoon, he was transferred to the general ward, but he was still unconscious. Leona sat by his side, holding his hand and watching him carefully. She waited patiently by his side. Later that evening, she was ecstatic when she saw that his eyelids moved, and he slowly opened his eyes. She cried, "David, you're awake! Doctor, come quickly! David is awake!" "You don't need to call a doctor. I'm all right." He smiled and whispered, "Leona, are you okay?" "I'm fine," Leona replied, still far more concerned about him. Her eyes twinkled as she said, "David, you shouldn't always try to protect me. If you hadn't, you wouldn't be so hurt now." "No. If you had been injured, it would have hurt me far more than I'm hurting now. I'm very happy that I was there to protect you," he said as he shook his head and smiled. She looked into his eyes and felt that he loved her. Over the last days, Leona had sensed that he felt more for her than just friendship. But he was still her sister's fiancé. She had thought that he was deliberately ignoring any affection that he felt for her. "David, you need to rest. I haven't told Lindsay what happened. I don't want to scare her. Now you've woken up, I'll call her and get her to come here to take care of you." She sighed softly, and then stood up to leave. "Leona," David said as he reached out and grabbed her hand. Her heart lurched. He stared into her eyes and said, "You must see how I feel about you." His words made her heart flutter. She looked at him but didn't know what to say. Her heart was a mess. "Do you really think that I visit you at Richmond University every day because I want to experience a peasant's life? Do you remember when we ate paella together by the lake? Because you were with me, I now find paella the most delicious food in the world. When I go to dinner with clients at fancy restaurants, I find all other food bland. In my eyes, you are just like the paella. After meeting you, other women seem dull to me. Leona, you must understand what I'm saying." Leona turned to him, and 2 tears fell from her face to the floor. She wiped away the tears, sighed, and said quietly, "Of course I know. But you're engaged to my sister. How can I—" David looked happy and said, "That's what you're worried about? Then I'll cancel the engagement with your sister." "What?" Leona was stunned. She thought for a moment and murmured, "How can I let you do that? If Lindsay knew that you canceled your engagement because of me, she would hate me." David said, "No, I think you're wrong. I don't love Lindsay and I don't think she loves me. She will thank you for giving us a reason to break off the engagement." Leona stopped at the door and looked at David. She thought, Lindsay did tell me that she had to marry David, not because she wanted to, but because her family wanted her to. She was only doing it to join her family with his. "Leona, will you marry me?" David asked. She didn't know what to do. She wanted to agree, but she still didn't think that she should. "I've made up my mind that I am going to marry you. If you don't accept this time, I will keep asking until you do. Even if things like today have to keep happening until you are convinced about my love for you. Leona, do you want me to get hurt again?" he said. "You know I don't want you to get hurt protecting me," she replied. He smiled and said, "Since you do love me, let's go together and talk to Lindsay and your father." Leona was too ashamed to face her family. "Please don't make me go. You can go by yourself." He took her hand and asked her to sit beside him. He said with a smile, "I'm not going alone. If you don't go with me, I'll keep going to your school and pretending to be a peasant. Everyone will laugh at me again. As long as you don't mind your future husband being mocked, that's fine." Leona blushed and said, "You come from such a good family. Why do you still want to pretend to be poor?" "I'll pretend to be anything for you," David said. He caught her eye and smiled, eyes twinkling. Soon, she couldn't help but smile back. His ploy had worked. The following day, David couldn't wait to speak to Leona's father, Charles Marvel, and her sister Lindsay. He wanted to go that very night, as soon as Leona said yes, but Leona was worried about his health. The next day, she was still worried about him, but he told her that his health was fine, and that the hospital had used the most advanced drugs for him. He assured her that he was now fully recovered. Leona said no more about it. David met with the 3 members of the Marvel family in the luxurious Continental Hotel. Leona was too ashamed to speak. Charles thought that David was just inviting them all to dinner. He had no idea what kind of discussion was in store for them that evening. "Mr. Marvel, Lindsay, I invited you here today because, Leona and I have something we need to tell you," David said solemnly. Charles and Lindsay looked curiously at each other. David's serious tone made them feel uneasy. They each wondered if it was about Lindsay's engagement. Leona only blushed and lowered her head. Charles said reassuringly, "David, if you have something to say, that's fine. Please go ahead." "Then I'll come straight out with it." David paused for a moment, and then said, "I want to break off my engagement with Lindsay." "What?" Charles was shocked. He dropped his glass, which fell to the ground and broke into pieces. He said with trembling lips, "David, we've been telling everyone about your marriage to Lindsay for such a long time. You are about to get married. How can you? Why now?" Charles wanted Lindsay to marry David Drake to help him win his bid for the development rights of the Heaven and Earth theme park. He knew that without the support of the Drake family, he could not complete the project. Moreover, the news about David and Lindsay's marriage had spread all through Washington, D.C.'s upper classes. David's decision could ruin the Marvel family for good. They would be seen as a joke. When Lindsay heard that David wanted to cancel their engagement, she was surprised. She tried not to let it show on her face, but secretly she was very relieved. She didn't actually like him that much. She had only agreed to the engagement for the sake of her family. "I know it's sudden, but please forgive me, Mr. Marvel. The fact is that I've met a girl who is much more suited to me than Lindsay," Daryl said. Charles's hand trembled as he asked, "And just who do you feel to be more suited to you?" David looked at Leona and answered affectionately, "She's your eldest daughter, Leona." "Leona?" Charles and Lindsay were equally shocked. They looked at Leona and David in astonishment. They couldn't understand what was going on. However, Charles's heart stopped racing. As long as David was still prepared to marry into his family, it didn't really matter which daughter he chose. David said, "Mr. Marvel, Leona and I really love each other. I want to propose to her. Do you approve?" "You have to listen to Leona's own opinion on this matter," Charles replied. He looked at Leona and asked, "Leona, what's your heart telling you? Do you want to marry David?" At that moment, everyone turned to look at Leona, and it made her feel very uncomfortable. She blushed with embarrassment and stuttered, I... She glanced at her sister. Lindsay quickly realized that Leona was reluctant to accept David for her sake. She took her hand and whispered, "Leona, do as your heart is telling you. I won't be angry." When she saw that Lindsay was smiling, Leona realized that she was not upset at all about the engagement being called off. Obviously, she had not really wanted to marry David anyway. She told her sister, "David is so perfect. I want to marry him." Charles said to David with a smile, "Since Leona wants to marry you, what else can I say? David, I agree. I can see that you and Leona are very much in love. Shall we agree on a wedding date now?" David took Leona's hand and said with a smile, "I think our original date is still fine, September 15th. Everything can go ahead as planned. We've just changed the bride." Charles thought for a few seconds, and then said with a smile, "Okay, that should be fine." "Leona, David is a good man. I know you'll be really happy together." Lindsay hugged her sister with a smile. When David saw how happy Lindsay was, he felt aggrieved. He realized that she had never wanted to marry him. She didn't care at all that the engagement was off. In fact, She seemed to be grateful to him for setting her free. He was disgusted that she was so happy not to be marrying him. Feeling rejected, his natural inclination was to try to win Lindsay back, to ask her for another chance. The rejection made him feel belittled and worthless. But although he felt extremely angry with Lindsay, he knew that he couldn't say anything in front of her family. After the meal was over, Charles said goodbye to David and left the restaurant with his 2 daughters. Watching Charles's car drive away, the smile on David's face gradually faded. He murmured, "Lindsay, you stupid cow. You laughed so happily just now. How dare you celebrate that I broke off our engagement? Well, don't worry. Even though I'm going to marry your sister, I'm not planning to let you go so easily. I've been thinking about you for too long." He took out his cell phone and sent a message to a group of his wealthy male friends in D.C. The message said, "Treat at Continental Hotel tonight. All come here." That evening, everyone from the group arrived at the Continental Hotel. David announced to them all that he was engaged to Leona. He told them that he would marry her. Besides Daryl and Colin, who had helped him with his schemes, everyone there was awed that David won Leona's heart in such a short time. They all praised and congratulated him. "David, you're amazing," one said enviously. Another said, "That's great news. We can't compete with you." "David is like Adonis," said another. The group of young men had several drinks and began to brag amongst themselves. In private, David thanked Daryl and Colin for helping him win over Leona and told them that he would do his best to help them in the future. They complimented David and told him that he would have won her even without their help. They were both very happy for him. David had a few drinks and then called another one of his friends, Jason Morley, to his side. He whispered, "I've got an offer for you. There's something I want you to help me with. I know your company's in debt. If you do what I ask, I'll sort it out for you and save your business." "Of course, thank you. I'll do whatever you ask." Jason's heart lifted. He had owed money for such a long time that his family was in danger of losing their entire business. It had been weighing heavily on his mind. "Very good. What I want you to do is go after Lindsay," David told him.
Thank you for listening to Crown TV. Please don't forget to subscribe, share and turn on the notification button.